Well, in the meantime, the ongoing U.S.-Israel war in Iran and the wider Middle East conflict has brought to the fore questions about Nigeria's readiness to proactively position itself against the socio-economic impact of such external vulnerability on the country's estimated 200 million citizens. Discussing this with me live from Abuja studios is, of course, the development economist and a public policy analyst, Professor Ken Ife. We thank you so much, Professor, for coming in tonight on the show. Good evening.
For having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. What are the realities of the ongoing Iran conflict right now in terms of you look at the oil vessels, the aviation, the logistic issues? What are realities of all of this put together? It's getting to 3 weeks by now.
Well, Boson, I don't know how many times in my program with you I have continued to emphasize that a feeding bottle economy like that of Nigeria should prioritize where you have a monocultural economy that is dependent on crude, and you do not want to follow the footsteps of those who are leading in crude production. America has 714 million barrels of strategic crude reserves. China has 1.3 billion barrels of crude reserves. And yet China doesn't even produce crude. Nigeria should have strategic reserves. And I've said several reasons why we should have those. You need to have price stability. You have to get a security of supply. You have to be prepared to absorb shocks. You have to even want to build resilience in your entire production chain. You want to produce crude reserve for your bottler refineries so that they can get access to crude. And when you have that reserve, when there's a shortfall on your supply, you cannot beef up from. This has been falling on deaf ear. Now that day has come, and we are now scrambling, and people are saying all kinds of things, come and bring subsidy problems. That is nonsense. We just have to do the basic thing that we have to do. Look at China. China is importing crude from Nigeria, but China has blocked any export of refined product. So is Russia that used to send out all the substandard. They've stopped. Kazakhstan has stopped. So how can you be sending out your crude, prioritizing sending out crude to somebody that doesn't want to let you have the refined product? And yet you have a massive capacity in the country, you won't give them crude. And when you give, NNPC is supposed to give them, they ask for 20 shipload. 13 of them is what they need to cover the country's requirement. They give them only five ship, and after 5, they are taking $3 premium. Then they now have to go through the back door to all the marketers to go and buy crude from them at extra premium of $6. Does Nigerian government get that $6 premium? We don't get it. Neither do you get this. So, it's not on. And we need to revisit this whole issue about strategic reserves, and it's not just on crude. There are other things. I think what we need to build is national emergency reserve fund. That's what we need to set up. That's a national emergency reserve fund. There are all kinds of.
Yes, that's what we're touching on that, Professor, because each time, because we depend so much on crude oil, each time we talk about global geopolitical issues and problems, everybody's mind go first to fuel and oils. And it's natural to think so. But again, we've got food security issues to deal with, my friend. We've got a whole lot of other issues to deal with. Healthcare, and what have you. We've got COVID-19. But again, for Nigeria is known as a country that has what you call a cat with 9 lives. We seem to always to emerge from crisis. For COVID-19, for example, we were able to go through it. Look at the 2008 global financial crisis. The central bank, the SEC and others handled that very well for us. Then you've got a few other issues. But then, do you think we have the necessary and adequate resilience and buffer for major global pullback headwinds such as the ongoing conflict in the Middle East?
Let me explain something. In the banking sector, we have foreign reserves doing quite well, over $50 billion. Now, that is intended to stabilize the export market and make sure that we have at least 9 months supply of forex to deal with import. that also deals with financial guarantees in case of any major crystallization of our risk. So you can see that idea is there, is within Nigeria. It's not then you have an ecological fund that is about 0.5% of federation account. Yes, that's fine to deal with those. Then you also have within the health fund, that primary health fund, 1% or so. But they should also prioritize funding for emergencies like providing vaccine and for all kinds of pandemic or epidemic that could arise and research. And so we have to make sure. Then you come to agriculture, we have rice fund. We have cotton and all the sugar fund, all that sort. So these are all ideas about that come to reserve. But how much of it is being used to build strategic reserves in terms of grain reserves, in terms of staple reserves, so that we don't have to run to East Africa to import food? So we need to get our act together. So, and then even in the area of petroleum, you have petroleum trust fund. Okay, you have a frontier basin fund, but that money can be drawn from there to build a strategic reserve of crude reserve. So we need to get all this whole thing together. Take about 2% of federation account and put it in this national reserve. And then also you also have this windfall tax that can come in. I hear mention of 30 trillion. These are where you get some substantial money and build the resilience that you need in our entire supply chain.
All right. So we've got a couple of funds sitting here and there: ecological fund, sugar development, and the rest, the rice and wine, what have you. So what's the problem then? Are these enough to mitigate vulnerabilities such as this? Because each time we get crises such as this, the government officials come out and say, look, we're sitting on top of it, we're monitoring issues, and then after a couple of days we say, well, some cup of rice, bag of rice, whatever, start going through a few Nigerians as palliatives or whatever. Is that the way to go about it?
No, the way this fund is money. You apply the money in stabilizing prices. You apply the money in contracting production of those reserve items. In other words, let's say Dangote is screaming for money to be crude to be given to him. Federal government could say, okay, we will give you 500,000 barrels a day for the next 30 days to produce for our strategic reserve. It's easy. He will do that for you. So that if you hold that reserve, when there is an issue, you can use it to stabilize price. You can use it to make sure there's availability. Do you know if we don't have this company producing refining, Nigeria would have been paying 2,400 or 2,500 naira per liter now, and you won't get the product. Because the countries you will expect to send the product to you are blocking them, and so you would have been in crisis. We would have been in deep crisis if we didn't have that production capacity. But the same thing goes for all these other funds, small funds we have in agri. What are they being used for? They are not being applied to stabilize. They are not being applied to actually produce for those reserves. What happens is that there's panic, and then the guy imports things from somewhere, and it's like firefighting.
Yes,
so absolutely unacceptable.
We want to move from fire brigade approach. Remember last year or thereabout, Mr. President, it was ordered that some food should be imported and told the customs to waive some form of levy or whatsoever so that we can have enough grains in the country, because we've got major downside because of the insecurity and what have you. So what do we need to do as a strategic approach? You talk about a fund, but that's just money sitting somewhere in a bank. What else do we need to do, structurally speaking, in a country to prepare for crisis in food, crisis in Medicare, for example, in case you have another COVID-19, whatever it is, or we've got to deal with serious national, international security breach around the country in terms of logistics, for example. We don't have vessels on the sea. We don't flag Nigeria's official flag in the skies, as it were. So what do we do? What structurally needs to change? What structurally needs to change? So is it just this fund sitting somewhere, or we create a new fund, as you're saying? How much billions should be there in dollars? How should it be applied?
Well, I've suggested that we could go for as much as 2% of our Federation Account Fund. And don't forget that the Presidential Order 9 has actually decapitated an NPC right now. So that 60% that they were burning, 30% for their operational costs, and then 30% for frontier, they're all coming down back to the treasury. So that's going to mean almost double what the governors are receiving. So this is an opportunity to sequester about 2% of that money.
Okay. How do we get that? Should Mr. President, tell the National Assembly to say, look, we want to sequester, we want to quarantine 2% of this as a national emergency fund for Nigeria? Would that be the approach? Can it be done by presidential order or take it to the National Assembly?
No, that's the approach. Yeah, and then it goes to the National Assembly request to say that's an act. It has to be backed by an act anyway. And then because you are going to be placing a first line charge on the revenue. So that has to be supported by an act, and then the fund is created. But it is not just creating the fund, as I've just mentioned so many similar funds, but it is the application of the fund. Because one is part of the fund is to maintain price stability. Part of the fund is to create the reserve itself. And then you do that by contracting out for people to, okay, let's take for example, Dangote has 30-day capacity for liters, 30-day supply in his tankers, in his tank farm that can supply our need. Why doesn't federal government have the same capacity as a reserve, so that 30-day supply of crude, of fuel is guaranteed, sitting somewhere? So that is the thing. And then when these things come, you start releasing and then maintain the price. Or even crude, you have similar amounts. So you pay somebody, you pay them, you take money from the fund to build that reserve, and then dish it out to maintain your OPEC quota, to maintain supply to the refineries, and then also to deal with contingency like what we are seeing right now, where the demand is a problem. So is in all cases, remember the time of COVID, it was agreed that Nigeria should fund vaccine manufacturer. Yes. And a friend of mine who came from America to manufacture, Nigeria couldn't give him any money. So he had to go back to Afrexim. So it's Afrexim Bank that is funding him now, and it's somewhere around the Abuja airport doing several vaccines. But it just tells you that the country is not serious. We say these things, we don't do them. We like the political way to put paid to some of these nice, decent policies. So they don't want to do any of this.
So right now, Professor, you think we should be having the National Economic Team sitting to work out what you're talking about, what you're suggesting on the show tonight? Because another crisis, we haven't seen the end of this.
Let me explain something. No, this is the beginning. What I'm saying is that, look, how many strategic reserves do we have? We have so many in the past of the country. But when they empty 75,000 tons was removed, nothing, go to them, they're empty. Why should they be empty? Why should they be empty? So anyway, but in terms of what is currently going on, I think what I think we should be doing is, because the windfall tax is going to come, but the last thing the government should contemplate is to bring in subsidy of any form or shape. Release the crude according to the PIA law to the company that has the capacity to refine them, and we know that they have the capacity to, once he's given the crude that he needs at the prevailing price and in Naira terms, he knows that he will guarantee supply. He also and then also stabilize the prices. Look at this trajectory. When the first time the price of the crude went from 68 to 82, it was moved on by about 26%. It's only increased by 12%. The PMS price. It went to almost 100%. It's only increased by about 20-something%. So it's very slow in increasing. But as soon as the price came down from 118 to 88, it brought down the price instantly. So that is realism, and that is nationalism. That is Nigerian first. But if the marketers, if we were at the mercy of the marketers, the price can collapse. They would not change price. And then you have queues, they will tell you that there's no fuel, and then you have long queue, you're paying 2,400 per plate, and nothing changes. So God placed us in this position of having the capacity, the refining capacity to deal with this challenge.
Yes, so we've got the Dangote refinery, that's sorted. But like you said, we both agree we need to build similar reserves and resilience in healthcare, for example, whether it's vaccine or drugs. And then we've got to build it in food as well. Because whatever happens, food is something is one of the man's most immediate need, as it were. So we need to build something very robustly around all of these, at least 3 pillars of food, fuel, and Medicare, at least in the first instance. So thank you so much, Professor. I will be touching base with you and tapping from your wealth of knowledge and insight in the industry. Thank you so much on matters of this. Professor Ken Ife, development economist and public policy analyst from Abuja Studios. Have a wonderful evening.